My name is Kalan Abdel. I am from the Department of Mechanical Engineering Department and PhD candidate at any department. I am the Vice President for the Graduate Student Association for Academic Affairs. Today I am very happy to be here at College of Media, Art and Design to have our Books and Videos conversation on interdisciplinary research. Welcome to Books and Videos. As an engineer, I do really believe in this. Art is the most effective and fastest way to the society and politics reform. I do really believe in this, and I'm really happy that we have Books and Videos in this department. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Zitcer. He is an assistant professor and Thesis director of Department of Art, Entertainment and Enterprise at Westphal. He has been part of Philadelphia Arts and Culture community since helping to found the UPenn, which has become a community gathering place for art and social change. Dr. Zitcer received his bachelor and master degree from UPenn University, and he completed his doctorate in urban planning and public policy at Westphal University. I would like to welcome Dr. Zitcer. So thank you so much, and thanks to those of you who came tonight, and thanks to those who are watching or watching the tape version archived later. It's a great pleasure to have you all here in the URBN Annex, which is part of the URBN Center, the fantastic new home of the Westphal College. We've just been here for 1 year, but we feel that this facility brings together all of the interdisciplinary activities that we have in our college and creates a synergy among all of our different programs. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome you here to our new facility. I want to keep my own remarks brief because I want to make time for our students to really take the spotlight, but Arts Administration is a program that's been around for about 40 years and trains emerging leaders in the fields of arts and culture management with a nonprofit focus. So students come to this program wanting to learn how to do marketing and development and strategic planning and leadership in the culture sector in Philadelphia and beyond. One of the things that is a feature of this program is that we have a research-based master's thesis requirement. And everybody has to come through the program and do a kind of project that speaks to their personal and professional ambitions, but is grounded in social science research techniques. So tonight we have Lindsey Crane and McCausland, who I think have exemplified our desire for work that is both scholarly rigorous, but also engaged with the issues of our time and of our region. And they will be presenting to you tonight, Rachel, on this idea of having it all, motherhood and work-life balance in the arts sector, which is a major conversation now nationally in every sector, but affects ours as well. And then Lindsey is going to talk about a series of efforts over time, so far to date unsuccessful, to create a dedicated tax for the arts in Philadelphia that would support our cultural and arts institutions. And she'll be explaining what the evolution of those efforts have been and why yet it has not come to pass. So the format for tonight's conversation is going to be that we'll have Rachel's presentation, then Lindsey's presentation, and we'll open it up to the floor for some questions and answers in a very informal and dynamic format. And then we'll get to go out and have some food together and break bread. So again, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to invite Rachel up to the podium.
Hi, everybody. Stop lunch up here. Keep me as brief as possible. So I'm Rachel McCausland. Thank you all so much for having me. I just finished my thesis several months ago, and I'm actually going to try to have it published. I'm going to submit it to a couple of journals, so if you have questions, I seriously welcome them, and any feedback you can give me. Gentle feedback. So, I will be talking to you today about the study that I did, the struggle between motherhood and executive leadership in Philadelphia's arts administration sector. This study, during which 8 women in Philadelphia's arts administration sector were interviewed, explores and identifies key contributors to the struggle and pursuit of work-life balance. And this includes organizational support, maternity leave policies, childcare preferences and availability, societal expectations of women, sacrifices inherent in executive leadership and organizational culture, and also establishes a firm foundation of research upon which future researchers should build. So this study is not new, right? Study of female leaders and their ability to simultaneously manage motherhood in their careers has been going on for quite some time. However, very little research about this topic exists within the nonprofit sector, and virtually no research exists in Philadelphia's arts administration sector. So my goal was really to sort of build a foundation of research, and in a lot of ways, my study turned out to ask a lot more questions than I think it answered. So here we go. So this is the context. I was in seminar and trying to figure out what I was going to write my thesis about, and there was this whole national debate sort of going on at the same time with these three women. So here on the left we have Anne-Marie Slaughter. She worked in the State Department directly for Hillary Clinton and wrote a rather explosive article in the Atlantic magazine called Why Women Still Can't Have It All. Next to her we have Marissa Mayer, who was elected CEO of Yahoo Incorporated, the first ever CEO of the Fortune 500 company to be hired while pregnant. And on the far right, we have Sheryl Sandberg in her book Lean In, I'm sure many of you have heard of. And these three women sort of engaged in a national, really sparked a national conversation about work-life balance and what it means to be a mother and to be leading a large company. And so, that being said, rather selfishly, I was like, you know, what are my options going to be? I want to be an executive in my field, and what does that mean for me? So off I went on my own little journey. So my methodology, the women I interviewed 8 women, 4 executive leaders and 4 rising leaders at organizations with an annual operating budget greater than $4 million and with at least 15 employees. This partially limited the scope of my research. As I was saying to Neville earlier, I wanted it to be a master's thesis, not a dissertation. And a topic this large had to be limited in some way. And they were in-person interviews. So my research was largely qualitative. I obviously was able to pull some quantitative figures out of it, but my goal was through these really in-depth interviews, one, I could get these women to trust me enough to share rather personal information with me, sensitive information, and therefore they were protected. Their identity is not revealed in any way. Their organizations are not revealed because some of the things these women told me certainly could jeopardize their employment. So, what I found through my research was that respondents identified some of the key contributors to the pursuit of work-life balance. These things include, number 1, a supportive partner. Now, you do not need to have a partner to have a child and have a job, right? Millions of women do this all the time. However, unanimously, the women that I interviewed said that having a partner, if you're going to have one, who is supportive of your career and behind it 100%, and will also be willing to shoulder a lot of the responsibility at home is absolutely critical to being able to balance work and motherhood. Secondly, mobile technology. Many respondents noted that modern technology, being able to check your email from a soccer game or a dance recital, or in the case of one of my rising leaders, from labor and delivery between contractions, is really helpful to be able to do this, right? Childcare, obviously, that means not only the preferred method, somebody's preferred method of childcare, but it's also available to her. She can afford it. Key in the nonprofit sector is very important. The realistic idea of sacrifice, this theme sort of kept emerging through my research. People would say, you know, well, I have to understand that I can't be in 2 places at once. And I think understanding that realistically, being able to choose, you know, do I have to go to my board meetings? Do I have to go to the soccer games? You know, that's really important as well. And then, of course, finally, you know, the amount of support that the organization gives to somebody is a huge determining factor as to whether or not, you know, she's able to balance doing all of these things. Not only in terms of policies, but also in terms of culture. Very important. So, to talk a little bit more about organizational support. First, flexible scheduling and work from home policies. Only 2 of my participants reported having written policies that allowed for such scheduling or the ability to work from home, but every single respondent said that their organizations had sort of unwritten policies about these things. You know, I could talk to my supervisor if you don't have anything in our handbook, but she lets me do this, or she would let me do this. Secondly, you know, related to that in culture, that's sort of a double-edged sword I found out. When I talked to women who were mothers, they said, well, because I had kids, my executives will let me work from home some days or let me rearrange my hours. And when I talked to women who did not have children, they said, well, you know, my supervisor will let so-and-so work from home one day because she's got to, you know, take care of her kids, but she doesn't want me to do that if I have to, you know, do whatever personal things that I have going on. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Third, employer expectations. This is really interesting. When asked whether employers had different expectations, professional expectations of people who were parents versus those who weren't, they said that they had lower professional expectations of people who were parents. They expected less of them professionally. Furthermore, all of the executive directors that I've interviewed said that they had higher professional expectations of their male employees who were fathers than they did of their female employees who were mothers. Right? So they expect more, like the bar's higher for fathers than it is for mothers that they supervise. Interesting, right? Incidentally, this morning, I was reading an article, sort of unrelated to this, but I was reading an article about this new national research that shows that actually fathers are paid more than men who don't have children, and mothers are paid less than women who don't have children. Anyway, number 4, maternity leave, of course, like this is huge, right? Super, super important. So before we dive into maternity leave policy for the organization, I'll just talk very quickly about the federal and state support provided to people. So the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA as I'll refer to it, is the only federal support that legally entitles an individual to take a leave of absence from work for maternity or paternity care. It provides 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave. You do get to keep your health care. Employers can require that you have to use up any remaining vacation or sick time in advance. So it is unpaid, but you get to keep your job. Sounds a little bit archaic, but it's actually it's insanely limited in scope. It's the most comprehensive maternity leave coverage that you're entitled to federally, but we're still very, very behind our peer nations, like Europe and Canada especially, in terms of what you're entitled to. So to bring this then to the statewide level, there's 25 states who have allowed for additional support that you're entitled to beyond FMLA, but again, it's pretty limited, and Pennsylvania is not one of them. So to Philadelphia, in a 2011 survey of nonprofit arts organizations, only 18 arts and cultural organizations had enough employees to be eligible for FMLA leave. That's about 4%, right? Philadelphia's got hundreds of tiny, tiny arts institutions. So what do they do? So the institutions that I looked at, you can see here the number of employees. Remember, if you have more than 50 employees, you're entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, right? So all these people are already entitled to that. So I had 4 institutions that had paid maternity leave and paternity leave. I had one with unpaid leave, 2 on short-term disability, and 1 with maternity leave. And for the most part, this is pretty consistent with the larger the organization, the more comprehensive the benefits package is. So this is, again, how it breaks down. We had 4 institutions that did offer paid leave. 1 institution that offered no maternity leave whatsoever, so individuals there can use up their personal time, 6 days, that's it. And then we have short-term disability, which is an interesting alternative to maternity leave. So it is an employee benefit that's offered through the insurance company. With the Affordable Care Act now, it used to be that if you had to register for it before you got pregnant, or you weren't eligible for it because pregnancy is a pre-existing condition. Obamacare's got a whole list of issues, but the one thing that applies here is that you can no longer be excluded from that because of pregnancy. So one of the interesting things I found, though, is that even for institutions that do offer maternity leave, it's very common that women might not take their entire leave. They felt like they had to work through their entire leave. Marissa Mayer at Yahoo, who I talked about earlier, very famously took a 2-week maternity leave and then went right back to work, and she was heavily criticized for that because it set some people said very bad example for female employees, that they would feel like they had to live up to that process. So one of our executive directors said this about her maternity leave that she provided for her employees. FMLA, the 12-week leave, is the basis for the conversation, but often there's the issue with making a certain piece of artwork. And depending on when the pregnancy falls, sometimes there's a conversation about a preferable time for leave. So, you know, we need you in the office tomorrow, you know, but maybe we could give you an extra week at the end or something like that. So now one of our rising leaders talks about her experience. She said, when I was pregnant with my first child, my due date happened to fall on the same day as our biggest fundraising event of the year. And when I told my boss and my board chair, both men, my due date, my boss just looked at me. So I worked that event, our gala, on my due date. And then I worked through my entire maternity leave. She continued. Okay. When I was pregnant with my second child, we were in the middle of a capital campaign. And I was emailing my staff between contractions and labor and delivery, and I was on a conference call in the hospital 12 hours after I gave birth. And I only took 2 months of the 3 I was offered, and I was back. I was on a conference call the day after I gave birth. The legality of it was not so good. I agree. Okay. So, I'll move on to child care preferences. I thought this was sort of interesting. I sort of anticipated that the rising leaders who, sorry, to jump back a little bit, rising leaders were people who sort of self-identified into that category. They were people who basically aspired to be executive leaders one day. I interviewed them because the executive directors, you don't often take that job until you are biologically no longer able to have children, right? You're at a certain age where that's no longer possible. So I wanted to talk to women who were going through this at the same time. So the rising leaders said that their preferred method of child care would be daycare, except for one who said live-in help. And the executive directors all said that live-in help was their preferred method of child care. I didn't delve too far into this, but my sort of 2 hypotheses is that you might not know what you need until you need it, right? And then also the number of hours worked was different. The rising leaders worked on average 60 hours a week, and executive directors, I think, worked an average of 85 hours a week, and live-in help just provides a lot more flexibility. So, all right. So this is what we all know, right? Can we do both? This is possible. Number 1 says, of course. But I did have to quit one job because of my child, because the demands were too great, and I never saw him or her. Again, protecting identity too. And quitting that job absolutely hurt my career trajectory, no doubt about it. And no question about it. Second one, executive director number 2 did not have children. She chose not to have children. Yes, but I wasn't able to do it. Number 3, yes, but I don't know how they do it. Now, I will tell you, looking back, it was absolutely the best because I don't know what I would have done with a child. Then the career was really trucking and has been ever since. I don't know how I would have ever raised a child. And number 4, she does have a child. She said, yes, I feel that there was a decision to make as to what type of role I could take on. The hours when I was an executive director were a lot. So yeah, I think there was a choice. And I left my last job because of my kids. I couldn't keep up with the hours. I was in executive leadership at another arts organization in Philadelphia for a while, and I had 1 child, and then I got pregnant with my second, and I just couldn't keep up with it. So now we'll hear from the rising leaders. He said, absolutely, yes, yes, yes. And rising leader number 4, obviously, that's a child as well. So I thought this was sort of interesting. You know, they all sort of said the same thing, but there are definitely some differences there. And so I asked the executive directors, I emailed them after all this happened. I said, so what do you think? What do you think about the women who work for you? Do you think that their perceptions vary from the reality, having been on the other side of it now? And executive director number 4 wrote this response. She said, because there are a few role models in the industry, women who work and have families, I do think the view is skewed for rising stars. In my opinion, I don't think they see the challenges of doing both. Yet perhaps this is a good thing. Maybe their innocence and determination is just what the industry needs. Somebody recently told me there are no left feelings anymore. If this is true, then it is us, women, holding ourselves back in the industry. If we spoke up a little more and demanded understanding and flexibility while working hard, maybe there would be more executives who are mothers. all 4 executive directors reported that at some point in their careers, they had made a conscious choice between having children and pursuing a particular job. So for the women for the 2 executive directors that did have children, that means that they each chose to leave a job for their children. And for the 2 executive directors who did not have children, they chose to pursue an executive leadership path, knowing that it meant doing that at the sake of having children. All right, gender inequality. So nationally, women outnumber men in the nonprofit sector. They're still paid significantly less. I was surprised to find this. I didn't add this into my research. The data is unavailable in Philadelphia. But women are paid, I think, an average of 66 cents on the dollar that every man makes, even in the nonprofit sector. And when asked if they perceived any gender inequality in Philadelphia's art administration sector, a few of them said no. Several of them said that they had experienced certain things within their boards, relationships with their boards. We know that board diversity is a problem in a lot of the nonprofit art organizations in the city. And so, I'm curious as to what what contributes to that. An interesting point about this is that half of the people that I interviewed were running arts institutions, and they were women. So my hypothesis here was that they would be less likely to experience it on a daily basis because the people that they supervise and report to, there needs to be an inherent respect there. Another finding of mine was that parents do exercise empathetic leadership. Executive Director number 1, who did have children, said, when I was general manager at my last organization, my boss didn't have children and didn't like children. And I had a small child and there was no empathy or sympathy in that environment for someone with children. Here I'm incredibly flexible. I've got a COO who has 4 little kids, so he's there, constantly saying, I've got to be here, I've got to be there, I'm off today, and I have to be very flexible about that. And she says, because she had an experience that wasn't so great, and she knew how hard it was to have that support, it was much more important to her to be able to offer that. Sort of conversely, Executive Director number 4 says about her fellow executives, I find here that while there's flexibility, there's a constant annoyance. They will say, well, you weren't in the office. A constant, I feel like I walk on eggshells all the time. It's not comfortable. So while I feel like I have been given the flexibility, again, these sort of unwritten policy, there's a lack of understanding from the executives. Both my executives are unmarried, neither of them has kids, and they don't have any responsibilities outside of work. Interestingly, all the participants who did not have children, sort of independently offered without being asked, that they were trying to be very flexible and understanding of the needs of people who do have children, their colleagues. All of the people that did have children felt like their colleagues resented them, especially the ones where there were unspoken or unwritten policies that had been, given to them. So there's a lot of sort of dissonance between answers here. So again, the way I set up my paper was basically to be a foundation for future research. This topic is huge, and I didn't feel like I could touch everything, so I sort of set up several areas in which I think the future researchers could build. The first area is wage equity. In order to better understand the depth of gender inequality within the sector, I think that research should be conducted on wages paid to individuals and whether there is any gender-based wage discrimination within the sector. There's little reason to believe that the local landscape would differ from consistent national trends. Without knowing this for sure, it's difficult to thoroughly understand the scope of the issue at hand. Secondly, work expectations equity. Again, many of the preliminary conclusions drawn from this research sort of stem from sort of this anecdotal claim that there are more women than men working in Philadelphia's arts administration sector. I don't know that that's true. People sort of offer this. They say, well, there's a lot of women in this field, and nationally that is true, but I don't know for sure if that applies in this sector, the exact ratio of women to men. Third, board relationships. I just talked about this a bit. It would be interesting to see how board relationships play into gender inequality within the institutions themselves, the ratio of women to men on boards in the city, and how all that works. And finally, the rising leader perceptions. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious to know what the perceptions are like and how they actually sort of stack up to executive leaders. So I think it would be really interesting to follow up with, say, these rising leaders in 5 or 10 years and see how their opinions of things have changed as well. So the implications, my conclusions. First, flexible policies for employees, they need to be adopted. I think that, and formally adopted. To me, the resentment that's bred by offering sort of unspoken policies is really sort of concerning, and can just be really detrimental to an institution's culture and morale. Secondly, organizations need to adopt maternity leave policies and adhere to them. Not only do I feel like, you know, a woman has to be able to have a baby and not worry about her job, she needs to feel like she can take the full amount of time that's offered to her, so the women that are working for her know that they can take that time as well. It just sets a really unhealthy precedent, in my opinion, especially in an institution where, in the nonprofit sector, we're already not paid as well as our corporate colleagues. Next, mothers need to establish boundaries for themselves. I felt like this was really important. Women need to be able to know that they don't have to answer their email from from the delivery room. They don't need to be on a conference call the next day or waddling around on their due date like in heels at a black tie event. That's just crazy to me. And it needs to be fixed. Next, recruiters need to base decisions on a candidate's professional accomplishments and experience. I didn't talk too much about this. Again, I sort of gave you guys the Reader's Digest version of my thesis. But for this one, I had several individuals tell me that they had been asked in job interviews, what are you doing with your kids? Do you plan to have children? Are you married? It's illegal. Ladies, it's illegal. Don't answer those questions to the job interview. It's just not okay. And finally, recruit board members who are dedicated to mission fulfillment, not necessarily ones who will look good on paper. And finally, future parents should establish realistic expectations. I talked about this a lot in the beginning of my presentation, but I think it's really important that, you know, as much as all of these things could be changed, and there are a lot of systematic supports that are in place that could be better and could be improved for women, I think that you know, if you establish realistic expectations, you know that you can't physically be in 2 places at once, and know that it's never going to be easy to do all of these things. It could just only be better. I think everybody would benefit. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you for that, Rachel. Fascinating. Actually, funny anecdote for all of you, we're roommates. And I did not actually know much about her thesis until tonight. We were so busy, so welcome to my thesis. Here we go. Okay, so hi, I'm Lindsey Crane, and as Andrew said earlier, my thesis was on the case for a dedicated attack to support arts and culture in Greater Philadelphia. And I initially came to this topic through our seminar, which is where we start on our thesis, and I read a fabulous paper by Elizabeth McCausland, who's one of the graduates of this program, on the Denver cultural tax. And I was sort of struck by this, and I thought this was very interesting. Well, come to find out, they have tried to institute this in Philadelphia for the past, since 1990, essentially. But I did not know that. A lot of people I feel like don't really necessarily know about these attempts, and so I was very interested to find out more about them and why a city that's as culturally diverse and rich as ours hasn't been able to implement this. So the case for a dedicated tax. And a little bit, some methodology in terms of, I did interviews with approximately 30 arts leaders in suburban Philadelphia and Philadelphia County. And when I'm talking about this fact, I'm talking about the 5-county region, which is Philadelphia County, Bucks County, Montgomery County, Chester County, Delaware County. And one of the things I'll sort of get into is that the region, if you know, a lot of people, it's actually much bigger than that when you think about it. So, but I did interviews with arts leaders in those, in all of these counties and got their opinions. A lot of them had been involved with the taxes in some way, had been advocates for it, or had helped write the legislation for it. And so I'm getting their opinions on what is it that just makes this such a challenge in this area. So A little bit to start. So cultural policy, dedicated taxes to support the arts. This is a type of cultural policy that can be enacted, typically at the state and local level. But cultural policy, just a little bit, in the U.S., it's a bit fragmented compared to our European counterparts if we think about this. In federal support, there's the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that is the federal arm of funding for arts organizations in the U.S. And then after that, of course, there's state governments and state arts agencies. Ours here, of course, is the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. They receive funding from the NEA. Actually, the NEA has to give out 40% of their overall congressional budget that they're given to state arts agencies. And to receive money from the NEA, you have to have a one-to-one match. So some states, they only match what the NEA will give, and then that's the arts funding for that state. Other states, they're much better about giving a bigger budget to their state arts agencies. And then we have our local governments who fund the arts. So the Philadelphia Cultural Fund is our city government arm for funding the arts, and that actually started, I believe, in 1991. And then we, of course, also have the Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy, and then our local arts agency is the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance. They also do some funding as well, but on a much smaller basis, typically. And so dedicated taxes are a form of this cultural policy, and most of them exist locally. There is one statewide dedicated tax that's in Minnesota, and it goes to a variety of issues, really, not just the art, but it's parks and heritage and things like that as well. So a brief history of arts and culture funding in Philadelphia. The Office of, well, I have to say actually at first that a lot of the art leaders I talked to largely considered Philadelphia behind the times in terms of arts funding. So like I said, it's a very culturally diverse city, and our funding just doesn't seem up to par when you consider New York and Los Angeles has great funding for the arts, and DC, of course, DC is a bit of an anomaly in terms of federal funding. But in Philadelphia, we have our Office of Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy. That's not always when it's title. It was the Department of Cultural Affairs at one point. But the interesting thing is that in Philadelphia, it's not part of the city charter, and this is unusual for most major cities. So in most major cities, the city charter establishes the Department of Cultural Affairs or the cultural arm, and here that's not the case, which means that it's up to each mayor whether or not they want to have one. And as such, it's been opened and closed and reopened over a course of several years. And the decree I was actually able to find online was from Wilson Good, but it's my understanding that there actually was a Department of Cultural Affairs with, I think, William Green was before him. But it was most recently closed by John Street due to budget restraints and cuts, and he actually was, or City Council and John Street were actually thinking about cutting the Philadelphia Cultural Fund at that time, and we were able to advocate for Philadelphia Cultural Fund to stay the same, but we lost the Office of Arts and Culture. And it was reopened under Mayor Nutter. And so it's unclear when Mayor Nutter finishes his term if the next mayor is going to be arts friendly and if we'll have this office to exist. But one of the things that they do the Percent for Art program, one of them, Art in City Hall. They also contribute to research. They've been using culture blocks. And so that's just a little bit, and their programs have expanded dramatically. The Philadelphia Cultural Fund is the fund from the city government that supports arts and culture organizations. It's currently, I think it's still at $1.7 million this year, if I'm not mistaken, but it was cut from about $3.2 million a couple years ago. It was established in 1991. Before that, they had what was called Class 500 grants, which was a pool of discretionary income that our city council members had, and essentially to get it that high, you had to have a relationship with them. And so organizations would, get to know them, advocate for themselves, and that's how we were able to secure any city funding. So those, my understanding is that those are still around, but very, very limited. The majority of the funding comes from PCF now. And then there is some direct city funding. And this, of course, has gone away over the years. A lot of cities, I think one of the things you see when these dedicated taxes are enacted is that the city is responding to a crisis of some kind, where the state government or the local government has cut funding to the zoo, and the animals will die if we don't enact a dedicated tax to save them. And so Here, we still have direct city funding for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, because the city owns that building. The Atwater Kent Museum, which is the Philadelphia History Museum, and then the Mural Arts Program, and other special projects over time. For example, the City of Philadelphia, I believe, also funded the Kimball Center at one point, but it's not ongoing right now. So funding in suburban Philadelphia is a little bit different. It's aside from the fact that it seems like, Philadelphia County, it seems like we could be a little bit better in terms of our funding support for the arts. In the surrounding counties, it's actually, we have more resources in the city, no doubt about it. So in Bucks County, which is our county to the north, they have a hotel motel tax that supports the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and arts organizations can get a piece of that by working with the Convention and Visitors Bureau. They're doing a festival, et cetera. It'll bring tourists here. That's why they'll get funding from that. They also have a cultural council, the Bucks County Arts and Cultural Council, and there are civic grants that organizations can go to their county politicians and sort of make nice of them and get some funding that way as well. Chester County is actually the only county, I don't know how many of you are from the area, but it's the only county that doesn't actually share a border with Philadelphia. So in a way, a lot of the arts leaders I talked to there said, we feel very removed, and the citizens feel that way. That there's, since we don't share the border with Philadelphia, that's one of the things that sort of they said why we would not want to support a tax like this. They have a hotel tax as well. It goes to the Convention and Visitors Bureau, but it does not, it's distinctly prohibited from funding arts and cultural organizations. So I was told that it's not very, it's very difficult to get money through the Convention and Visitors Bureau that way. But they do have a Main Street style program that they have been using to revitalize certain towns out in Chester County, and that indirectly supports arts and culture by giving them sort of tax subsidies for reviving areas. And then there's Delaware County. Now in Delaware County, there's no hotel or motel tax, and there's no countywide council, but the boroughs, like Media, has an arts council, and Media is a very sort of arts prolific town there. And then I think also in Delaware County, you can get some civic grants from the county government. And then Montgomery County is now the only one of the 4 counties that has a Democratic county seat. And this is the first time in 100 years that this has happened, that there's a Democratic majority there. The rest of the counties are Republican run, and that, you'll see, sort of plays, definitely plays a bit, has a bit of an interesting relationship with Philadelphia County. And so in Montgomery County, they also have a hotel motel tax, goes to the Convention and Visitors Bureau. Organizations can petition themselves for county funding. They also have this is a relatively new initiative called Creative Montco, which is an arts and culture civic initiative run by volunteers, arts people in Montgomery County. The interesting thing about Creative Montco is they actually have a strategic plan, and part of their strategic plan is to possibly get a dedicated tax in Montgomery County to support arts and cultural organizations. So I thought that was very interesting, and I think that's about a 20-year plan or something like that. So there have been, as I said, past attempts at a regional funding mechanism in Philadelphia. So they first formally began in 1990. They were really, a lot of the research that I found starts with Professor Ted Hirschberg, who was with the University of Pennsylvania, who worked a lot, especially at the beginning, on trying to unify our arts and culture sector in terms of regionalism, trying to unify the 5 counties and get us to all think in one, sort of with one mind and advocate as such. So a lot of these, and I have actually all the bills here, these are all the bills that would have at some point established a regional funding mechanism. So it's important to note that that's not necessarily a dedicated tax, right? So, but a regional funding mechanism a lot of times is funded by a tax. So these were honestly very opportunistic and very reactionary. And the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance has also been involved, I have to say, from the very beginning, and they are still involved with this. And they have been guided by sort of cultural plans for the sector. And a lot of those have featured initiatives for regional funding, and then sometimes it'll drop out because they realize they can't do it. And so, but it's always sort of been on the back burner, I guess you could say, for things. So a couple of these bills, most of them would have established what they called the Southeastern Pennsylvania Economic Development Authority. That was their first one in 1991, where that would have directed money from an additional tax, a couple of additional taxes. I think one was on gas, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the others were, but some of that would have been directed towards arts and cultural organizations. And of course, that bill died in session. And I have to say, all of these died in session, so these never went anywhere, sadly. And then after that, they started to focus on what was called Southeastern Pennsylvania Scientific and Cultural District. And all of those, the one that I really, the closest that, the arts leader said the closest that we ever came to establishing a dedicated tax was, I believe it was Senate Bill 687 in the 2005-2006 general session. So that was actually funding that would have come from a tax that still exists on liquor sales in the state. They, at that time, were discussing whether or not to open stores on Sundays. And so they decided to open some on Sundays, and they're still open. And they were trying to divert revenues from the Sunday store sales to the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts and the Department of Community and Economic Development, the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. And so this would have come from an emergency tax which still exists on liquors from the Johnstown flood that happened, I think it was in 1936. So it might anger you to know that we're still being taxed to pay for a town that has been rebuilt 100 times over. And so they decided that some of the money, whatever percentage, I think it ended up being, it would have been approximately $3 million extra per year for arts and cultural organizations. That sort of seems like a small amount, but you know, it's not nothing. And one of the reasons that this actually ended up, I think, failing in a lot of ways is that there were arguments amongst the sector how we split that up. It's just $3 million, who gets what and why. And so that sort of died in session as well. And now, so a brief little bit on mineral taxation in Philadelphia. We can talk about this all night, right? So Philadelphia is one of the highest tax cities in the United States. One of the pieces of research I used in my paper was from the government of the District of Columbia. Did research, and they actually found that we are second in terms of nearly all family sizes that they looked at, family of 3, family of 2, family of 4, in terms of what we pay in taxes versus income. And so, and overall we had the second highest tax rate. So that is definitely one of the things that makes it very difficult to enact something like a dedicated tax here. There's not really, people don't want to be taxed more. So the taxes here are broken into individual taxes and then business taxes. And I list some of these here because typically for dedicated taxes that support the arts, they are mostly sales taxes, property taxes, and then hotel motel taxes. And there is one actually that is a sin tax of sorts. It's in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which covers the city of Cleveland. They have a sin tax on cigarettes that funds their arts and culture funding right now. But the majority of them would be what we would consider individual taxes. And then, of course, we have some business taxes here. Sales and use tax. This is important. In Philly, the sales and use tax is 8%. Right now, it's 7% in Allegheny County. And Allegheny County, of course, obviously has a dedicated tax from the arts directly across the state. And 6% is the state mandate. So Philly is already a little bit higher for various reasons. So, okay, so I interviewed people. So I did research, found out what these attempts were, and then I interviewed people and I said, what are our challenges? Why is this happening? And by and large, and these are actually in order of, so actually one of the things I should say about the interviews is clearly these are people's opinions, right? But what everybody said fit into these things. It really didn't go outside of here, which I thought was sort of fascinating. They all essentially hit these points. And the biggest one that people mentioned was the relationship between the city and the suburbs, and that it's very tense in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons for that, too, is a tax, the wage tax, which stipulates that anybody who earns a living in the city has to pay money to the city, even if you live outside the city. And it's varying amounts based on where you live or where you work. So that was by far the single biggest impediment to regional funding mechanism, and it's clear in the research that the arts leaders in the city and the suburbs still aren't unified in terms of what they think this sector needs. It's very a lot of it, the city obviously, they're very Philadelphia-centric, and they very much think that an arts regional funding mechanism is a possibility. And the people in the suburbs said to me, we just want to get some support out here. We want our politicians to understand what we do more, So there's a difference there. And then funding mechanism and distribution was the second highest issue people mentioned and challenge to this. And so one of the problems is that in a lot of the past attempts, the thing they're struggling with is, do we create the funding mechanism now, or do we think, okay, big organizations will get this cut, small organizations will get this cut. Do we figure that out now and then advocate to get this cut, or do we try to get the money first and then we'll decide how to do this? So, and there's never been a clear-cut answer for that, and I think that that's always sort of people are hesitant to really throw their weight behind something if it's not clear how it's going to be paid out. The environment. There was a brief, I actually don't think this turned into a Senate bill or a House bill, but shortly before September 11, 2001, they were discussing diverting, I think, some of the hotel tax revenues in Philadelphia to arts and culture organizations. Then September 11th happened, and the hotel business dropped out for a while. So that was the one that got rid of that. So essentially, the environment is very influential on A, passing a dedicated tax to begin with, and B, once you do have a tax, whether or not it can stay around. A lot of the sales and use taxes that are used for this purpose, the 2008 recession altered greatly what these organizations were receiving. And then the politics behind this as well. So there's been a lack of support from key political figures. There's never been really, somebody who stood up. There's a key political figure that said, look, we need to do this, and I'll put my weight behind it. And there's no changing of regional funding mechanism. And at the same time, the arts have, I have to say, we haven't really been that good at advocating or lobbying for ourselves. 1 minute. And then a lack of a strong case for support. This may seem kind of funny because we have a very thriving arts and culture sector here, but I ultimately think that we have not been very good at identifying what our value is to the community. And we can't ask people to pay more until we realize why, what for, pay more, what for, is this idea. No diverse base of support in terms of business leaders. That's really what a lot of people are referring to, not having business leaders. Lack of resources. It takes a lot of time. All the campaigns that I've studied for dedicated taxes in other areas each cost over $1 million, sometimes more. And even then, some of them were not successful. So you're out $1 to $2 million for something that may or may not work. So you have to commit to it. And it takes all arts organizations to commit funding and time and human resources to it. Taxation is just unpopular as well. And in Philadelphia, this is especially important, the existence of other social needs and budgetary constraints. I'm sure we all are aware of what's happening in the Philadelphia School District right now, and the pervasive, homelessness issues and all kinds of pension issues, all kinds of other things that the city is struggling with. It's very hard to say, fund the art when, schools are being closed. We also have issues with regional definitions. We could easily include southern New Jersey and northern Delaware in terms of who patronizes the arts in this area. Timing of all of these attempts, timing is very key. It takes the right proposal at the right time with the right people, essentially, and that's never existed. And then issues with valuing the Philadelphia art scene in general, and sort of being undervalued. So essentially, the dedicated tax to support the arts through public policy. I think you have to answer the question, pay more what for? I think it could be. I think it depends on the area. I think we could do it here. I think we're a little ways away. But some thoughts for the future. I think it will not succeed as a 5-county initiative. I think it has to be single county. And I think the most likely county, of course, is Philadelphia County to do that. I think it's best if it's a sales tax, because the scheme is a little less aggressive in this state because it doesn't apply to grocery foods or clothing items or anything like that. And then, I know I'm probably out of time, but the one thing that I think that they could do is allow an additional sales tax throughout the entire state that any county could enact if they wanted to. So that leaves the discretion and institution of the tax up to the individual counties. And to be based the way it is in Allegheny County where Pittsburgh is, then it's a 1% sales tax for half the funds. 50% of them go back to the municipalities in that county, and the other 50% are for quality of life, and that the county can decide what that is. If that's arts and culture, if that's parks and rec, if that's heritage, or what have you. And I think that since that already exists in the state, I think that we have our best chances of getting this legislation passed, since there's a precedent for every county in the state. So I think that that's what we should throw our weight behind now. So that's it.
Well, I want to thank Rachel and Lucy so much for these excellent presentations. I'm wondering, do we have a couple of minutes where we can do questions? And then we can also go out and have some food together. I know we have a class that has to leave at some point, so people who are in class this evening can get up and go when they need to, not without taking food on your way.
That's right.
Do you want to just come out, Rachel, and we'll pull up a couple of chairs? And just, I'll pull you. Oh, thank you. And you guys can have a seat. I'll sit in the moderator. I'll get a chair. Come over here. Does anyone have a question for either of the two presenters?
Did you have any personal relationships with the women you interviewed before you selected them? Because I feel like they are really personal.
It's very personal. I knew one of them beforehand. I tried. Now I had to sort of narrow down my pool of people based on the criteria, right? By like budget size and number of employees, because for a number of reasons. And then I just sort of looked at that list, like who those were, like what organizations they were, and said, do I know of anybody? But it got to a point really where I was like emailing the director of development at whatever company and saying, hi, I'm doing this paper, we've never met, will you help me out? So of all the people that I interviewed, the only one I knew the answers to any of the questions about was one person. So.
Did anyone say no?
No, I had a couple of people not answer my email, and yeah, but nobody came right out. I have to say that the women that I interviewed were the ones that allowed me to interview them were very supportive of it, and they were really interested in what I was doing. So at least they acted that way.
I found that too, actually, in the interview.
Yeah.
We're good.
Actually, for you, I've got questions for both of you, but for you, do you see any, just anecdotally, do you see any correlation between the ages of what generation they belong to, and the generation that answered, I fully expect to have a very healthy work-life balance, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I found. Again, like in the interest of time, didn't display like all the demographic info of the women, but the executive directors were all older than the rising leaders, probably not surprisingly. And so yes, and I couldn't figure out if those attitudes were colored more by generation or simply by age and experience, having sort of being on the other side of that whole decision-making process, both career-wise and family-wise. But yeah, there definitely were differences, and a lot of the research I did as a part of my literature review, absolutely sort of generations think about things much differently. Yeah.
Chief?
Yeah, another question about the, for Rachel, is you chose organizations with a budget of $4 million or more. So and some of the questions about what kind of child care you prefer, one of the things that I wondered in listening to the presentation is whether the response would have been very different in smaller organizations. Because with a lower budget, and this is just an assumption, my assumption would be that salaries would be lower.
Yeah.
And the ability, and for example, the ability to pay a full-time, sleep-in care provider is going to vary widely if you're making 35 or if you're making, 135.
Right. Yeah, I definitely, so that was part of the reason I limited my research to a certain budget increment, was because I felt like the demands on somebody, an executive director and an employee, with one coworker versus having 25 coworkers was just too different to be able to compare them. I do think that, and a lot of research has shown, again, not so surprisingly, that one of the biggest criteria for being able to match your ideal method of childcare with availability is cost. Like I know there's a daycare a block from my office, and it costs $2,100 a month to have your kid there. Like, which, you know, for a lot of women in this sector is more than they make. So, you know, absolutely, I think it definitely is a determining criteria, for sure.
I wanted to know, when you were looking at, because it seemed like, I mean, I don't know if it's you just sitting on to it, but it seemed like you talked a lot about the, like, what the women perceived as the challenges, like, related to their boss. Did you look at anything, like, involving the people who worked under them?
I didn't, and in my paper, I taught in my sort of expanded recommendations. I felt like that was really important because, you know, the people, it's one thing for them to sit there and say something to me, but I was very curious. You know, like we looked at executive director number 1 talks about how she will have a conversation with her employees about the ideal time for them to take their maternity leave, as if it's something that really can, like you wouldn't ask somebody to reschedule their open heart surgery, so why would you ask them, you know, to move their leave otherwise? And so it's definitely something I think should be done, but it was definitely outside the scope of my research. Yes.
Morgan, you said you had a question for Lindsey as well.
I do have a question for Lindsey, actually, because I actually have an executive job interview tomorrow, so both of these things are kind of close to my heart at the moment. The position is one where part of their mission is advocacy, and it's a two-county organization. In your literature review, did you see any characteristics that counties shared or regions shared in which they did become successful? You know, in what ways would it be possible? What would a county have to have being able to, you know, to make it give it a larger voice with Philadelphia?
Well, in terms of the area here, I have to say that was sort of what was so staunchly different is that, and all the art theaters were like, look, we just got a Democratic majority in Montgomery County for the first time in 100 years, but otherwise for a long time now it's been Democratic Philadelphia County with Republican-based, you know, other counties, and they've always, one of the main reasons they've not wanted to do a 5-county tax is they are convinced that the money will leave the county and not come back because the majority of their organizations are in Philadelphia County. And so that has been by far the biggest thing that everybody has said is that there's no guarantee and no county, you know, Democrat or Republican is going to throw their weight behind money that leaves the county. So but I think also maybe we haven't identified a way to get the money back to the county per se.
So maybe there's something area there as being not having that plan for how we're going to distribute it.
Exactly. Yeah, they've never been able to say that it wouldn't happen. So,
Lindsey, you also have in your paper a number of examples of successes that happen in other regions.
That's true.
So are there quickly any words you could say about a successful example in terms of the characteristics of the regional government or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I have to say for the multi-county ones, the ones that I'm just thinking about this. Yeah. So Denver, which is a 7-county region, and the real reason I think that was successful, that happened back in 1989. They cut funding. So that was the zoo example I gave. Their marketing campaign was "Our polar bears will die if this doesn't happen." And so, you don't want the polar bears to die. Exactly. So so they really, the people in that area, organized around the fact that there was this crisis in funding. And then the other example is Detroit, where there are 3 counties there that now fund single institutions. So I have to say the interesting thing about Detroit is that before the zoo and the Institute of Arts got their property tax mills, they tried twice to get a tax in those 3 counties to support 17 institutions. They failed both times. Both times they had the money and power of the 3 car companies up there behind them, and they still couldn't make it happen. And so it was only when it became these single organizations that they all rallied and said, okay, we can do that, but not all 17 organizations. So
let's take one more question, and then we can all go outside and eat and continue the conversation outside. Anyone else have a final question?
Lindsey, you mentioned Minnesota. It's always been really interesting to me because they have a statewide arts dedicated tax, and now they are the highest per capita in terms of public arts funding.
Exactly.
And that was because they partnered with a wide and disparate group of entities, outdoorsmen. They had photos you see of art advocates, next to hunters in camouflage, advocating for this tax. It's just, do you think Philadelphia needs to get the arts out of the silo and make something like that happen?
Absolutely. I think that the best chance we have is to say, to consider a quality of lifestyle tax where you include libraries and parks and rec and things, just all kinds of things. Because I think, audience participation in this sector is increasing actually. I think the recent GPCA research shows that, but we still don't touch everybody. And, if many more people are influenced by libraries in the city and parks in the city than the arts. So I think that would definitely make a much stronger case. I think people have been unwilling to share that, but I absolutely think we should consider it.
Well, I want to thank everybody once again for coming, and also another hand to our presenter.